This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. This is going to be chapters 7 and 8 of the quote-unquote forgotten book of American inventor Samuel Morse. He wrote this in 1835. It's called Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. And it's a book, one of several books that the Collins brothers are afraid to research. That's Philip and Paul Michael, I believe. You hear them on all kinds of internet radio shows, and they're afraid to look into this stuff. I wonder why. Anyway, with that, Chapter 7, Samuel Morse's book. Let me next show the political character of this ostensibly religious effort from the sentiments of the Austrian emissaries expressed to their foreign patrons. The very nature of a conspiracy of this kind precludes the possibility of much direct evidence of political design. For Jesuit cunning and Austrian duplicity would be sure to tread with unusual caution on American ground. Yet, if I can quote from their correspondence some expressions of antipathy to our free principles and to the government, some hinting at the subversion of the government, prevailing partialities for arbitrary government, and siding with tyranny against the oppressed, and some acknowledgments of political effects to be expected from the operations of the society, I shall have exhibited evidence enough to put every citizen who values his birthright upon the strict watch of these men and their adherents, and to show the importance of some measures of repelling this insidious invasion of the country. The Bishop of Baltimore, writing to the Austrian Society, laments the wretched state of the Catholic religion in Virginia, and as a proof of the difficulty it has to contend with, a proof doubtless shocking to the pious docility of his Austrian readers, he says, quote, I sent to Richmond a zealous missionary, a native of America. He traveled through the whole of Virginia. The Protestants flocked on all sides to hear him. They offered him their churches, courthouses, and other public buildings to preach in, which, however, is not at all surprising, for the people are divided into numerous sects, and know not what faith to embrace. In consequence of being spoiled by bad instruction, they will judge everything themselves. They, therefore, hear eagerly every newcomer, unquote. The bishop, if he had the power, would of course change this bad instruction for better, and, as in Catholic countries, would relieve them from the trouble of judging for themselves. Thus, the liberty of private judgment and freedom of opinion, guaranteed by our institutions, are avowedly an obstacle to the success of the Catholics. Is it not natural that Catholics should desire to remove this obstacle out of their way? Footnote. A Catholic journal of this city, the Register and Diary, was put into my hands, I, Samuel Morse, as I have completed this last paragraph. It contains the same sentiment, so illustrative of the natural abhorrence of Catholics to the exercise of private judgment, that I cannot forbear quoting it. Quote, we seriously advise Catholic parents to be very cautious in the choice of school books for their children. There is more danger to be apprehended in this quarter than could be conceived. Parents, we are aware, have not always the time or patience to examine these matters, but if they trust implicitly to us, we shall, with God's help, do it for them. We read that they may not read, unquote. How kind. They will save parents all the trouble of judging for themselves, but, quote, we must be trusted implicitly, unquote. Would a Protestant journal thus dare to take liberties with its readers? End of footnote. My Lord Bishop Flaggett of Bardstown, Kentucky, in a letter to his patrons abroad, has this plain hint at an ulterior political design, and that no less that the entire subversion of our Republican government. Speaking of the difficulties and discouragements the Catholic missionaries have to contend with in converting the Indians, the last difficulty in the way, he says, is, quote, their continual traffic among the whites, which cannot be hindered as long as the Republican government shall subsist, unquote. What is this but saying that a Republican government is unfavorable in its nature to the restrictions we deem necessary to the extension of the Catholic religion? When the time shall come that the present government shall be subverted, which we are looking forward to or hope for, we can then hinder this traffic? Mr. Baraga, the German missionary in Michigan, seems impressed with the same conviction of the unhappy influence of a free government upon his attempts to make converts to the Church of Rome. In giving an account of the refusal of some persons to have their children baptized, he lays the fault on this, quote, too free government, unquote. In a more despotic government, in Italy or Austria, he would have been able to put in force compulsory baptism on these children. Footnote, compulsory baptism. Perhaps Father Baraga was thinking of the facilities afforded in Spain in the time of Ximenes for administering baptism when, quote, 50,000 Moors under terror of death and torture received the grace of baptism, and more than an equal number of the refractory were condemned, of whom 2,536 were burnt alive, unquote. May our government long be, quote unquote, too free for the enacting of such barbarity. End of footnote. These few extracts are quite sufficient to show how our form of government, which gives to the Catholics all the freedom and facilities that other sects enjoy, does from its very nature embarrass their despotic plans. Accustomed to dictate at home, how annoying it is to these Austrian ecclesiastics to be obliged to put off their authority, to yield their divine right of judging for others, to be compelled to get at men through their reason and conscience, instead of the more summary way of compulsion. The disposition to use force, if they could, shows itself in spite of all their caution. The inclination is there. It is reined in by circumstances. They want only strength to act out the inherent despotism of popery. But let me show what are some of the political partialities which these foreign emissaries discover in their letters and statements to their Austrian supporters. They acknowledge their unsuspicious reception by the people of the United States. They acknowledge that Protestants in all parts of the country have even aided them with money to build their chapels and colleges and nunneries, and treated them with liberality and hospitality and strange infatuation, have been so monstrously foolish as to entrust their children to them to be educated, so infatuated as to confide in their honor and in their promises that they would use no attempts to proselyte them. And with all this, does it not once occur to these gentlemen that this liberality and generosity and openness of character are the fruits of Protestant republicanism? Might we not expect at least that popery, were it republican in its nature, would find something in all this that would excite admiration and call forth some praise of a system so contrasted to that of any other government, some acknowledgments to the government of the country that protects it, and allows its emissaries the unparalleled liberty even to plot the downfall of the state? But no, the government of the United States is not once mentioned in praise. The very principle of the government through which they are tolerated is thus slightingly noticed. Quote, the government of the United States has thought fit to adopt a complete indifference toward all religions, unquote. That's from the Quarterly Register from February 1830, page 198, apparently. They can recognize no nobler principle than indifference. Some compliment, huh? Again, of the people of our country, they thus write, quote, "We entreat all European Christians to unite in prayer to God for the conversion of these unhappy heathen and obstinate heretics," unquote. We are spoken of as a country, quote, "on which the light of faith has hitherto not shined," unquote. Quote, "a vast country destitute of all spiritual and temporal resources," unquote. But if Austria is mentioned, what are the terms? Quote, "Your society, the Leopold Foundation, which is an ornament to the illustrious Austrian Empire, the noble and generous inhabitants of the Austrian Empire," unquote. Quote, "of many circumstances in our condition, few perhaps your happy empire can form a correct notion," unquote. And again, quote, "here are many churches, if you may so call the miserable wooden buildings differing little from the barns of your happy land, Austria, happy land," unquote. How enthusiastic, too, is another bishop who writes, quote, "We cannot sufficiently praise our good Emperor of Austria. Were we to extol him to the third heaven," unquote. Such are the political partialities which are discovered in various parts of these documents. Are they in favor of our republican darkness and heathenism and misery, or of Austrian light and piety and happiness? In the struggles of the European people for their liberty, do these foreign teachers sympathize with the oppressor or with the oppressed? Quote, "France no more helps us," unquote. Charles X had just been dethroned, end of parentheses. Quote, "and Rome, beset by enemies to the church and public order, is not in a condition to help us," unquote. And who are these men stigmatized as enemies of public order? Why, they are the Italian patriots of the Revolution of 1831, than whom our own country, in the perils of its own revolution, did not produce men more courageous, more firm, more wise, more tolerant, more patriotic, men who had freed their country from the bonds of despotism in a struggle almost bloodless, for the people were with them, men who, in the spirit of American patriots, were organizing a free government, rectifying the abuses of papal misrule, and who, in the few weeks of their power, had accomplished years of benefit. These are the men afterwards dragged to death or to prison by Austrian intruders, and styled by our Jesuits enemies of public order. Austria herself uses the self-same terms to stigmatize those who resist oppression. I will notice one extract more, to which I would call the special attention of my readers. It is from one of the reports of the Society of Lyon, which society had the principal management of American missions under Charles X. When this bigoted monarch was dethroned and liberal principles reigned in France, the society so languished that Austria took the design more completely into her own hands, and through the Leopold Foundation, she has the enterprise now under her more immediate guardianship. Quote, "Our beloved King, Charles X, has given the society his protection, and has enrolled his name as a subscriber. Our society has also made rapid progress in the neighboring states of Piedmont and Savoy. The pious rulers of those lands and the chief ecclesiastics have given it a friendly reception," unquote. Charles X, be it noticed, and the despotic rulers of Piedmont and Savoy took a special interest in this American enterprise. The report goes on to say, quote, "Who can doubt that an institution which has a purely spiritual aim, whose only object is the conversion of souls, desires nothing less than to make whole nations, on whom the light of faith has hitherto not shined, partakers of the knowledge of the gospel, an institution solemnly sanctioned by the supreme head of the church, which, as we have already remarked, enjoys the protection of our pious monarch, the support of archbishops and bishops, an institution established in a city under the inspection of officers, at whose head stands the great almoner, and which numbers among its members men alike honorable for their rank in church and state, an institution of which His Excellency the Minister of Church Affairs lately said in his place in the Chamber of Deputies that, independent of its purely spiritual design, it was of great political interest." There you have it, folks. Side note, there you have it. They're admitting it. They're admitting it. The Congress of Vienna, the Treaty of Verona, Austria, the Vatican in the early 1800s. This wasn't just a purely spiritual design, they say. It was of great political interest to infiltrate the United States. There you have it. Samuel Morse documents it again. "Observe that great pains," oh, that was the end of the quote. "Observe that great pains are here taken to impress upon the public mind the purely spiritual aim, the purely spiritual design of the society, and yet one of the French ministers in the Chamber of Deputies states directly that it has another design, and that it was of quote-unquote great political interest." He gives some of these political objects, quote, "because it planted the French name in distant countries, caused it, by the mild influence of our missionaries, to be loved and honored, and thus opened to our trade and industry useful channels," unquote. Now, if some political effects are already avowed as intended to be produced by this society, and that too immediately after reiterating its purely spiritual design, why may not that particular political effect be also intended of far more importance to the interests of despotism, namely, the subversion of our republican institutions? Okay, that was the end of Chapter 7. Now on to Chapter 8. Chapter 8 of Samuel Morse's 1835 long-lost classic, Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. But some of my readers, notwithstanding they may be convinced that it is for the interest of despotism to subvert our institutions, and are even persuaded that this grand enterprise has been actually undertaken, may be inclined to ask, in what manner can the despots of Europe effect, by means of popish emissaries, anything in this country to counteract the influence of our liberal institutions? In what way can they operate here? With the necessity existing of doing something from the instinct of self-preservation to check the influence of our free institutions on Europe, with the funds provided and agents on the spot interested in their plans, one would think it needed but little sagacity to find modes and opportunities of operating, especially too when such vulnerable points as I have exposed, parentheses, and there are many more which I have not brought forward, end of parentheses, invite attack. To any such inquirers, let me say there are many ways in which a body organized as are the Catholics, and moving in concert, might disturb, to use the mildest term, the good order of the Republic, and thus compel us to present to observing Europe the spectacle of republican anarchy. Who is not aware that a great portion of that stuff which composes a mob, ripe for riot or excess of any kind, and of which we have every week or two a fresh example in some part of the country, is a Catholic population? Footnote: priests control the mob. If further proof were wanting of the fact of the supreme influence of the Catholic priests over the mob, it is opportunely furnished in the testimony on the trial of the rioters at Charlestown, Massachusetts. Mr. Edward Cutter testified that the Lady Superior, in an interview previous to the burning of the convent, thus threatened him. She said, quote, "The bishop had 20,000 of the vilest Irishmen under his control. Who would tear down the houses of Mr. Cutter and others, and that the select men of Charlestown might read the Riot Act till they were hoarse, and it would be of no use," unquote. Wow, it sounds like one old shrew, huh? But if any doubt is thrown over Mr. Cutter's testimony because he is a Protestant, hear what the Lady Superior herself testifies. "I told him," quote, she says, "I told him, quote, that the Right Reverend Bishop's influence over 10,000 brave Irishmen might lead to the destruction of his property and that of others," unquote. So, well, she's not hiding it. Here we have the startling fact, acknowledged in a court of justice by the superior of the convent, that the bishop has such influence over a mob of foreigners that he can use them for vengeance or restrain them at his pleasure. The question that occurs is, how much stronger is it necessary for this foreign corps to become before it may prudently act offensively against our noxious Protestant institutions? Noxious to them. The fact is established by Catholic testimony that the popish population is not an unorganized mob, but is moved by priestly leaders, Jesuit foreigners in the pay of Austria. They are ready to keep quiet or to strike as circumstances may render expedient. But exclusive of other proof, another most important fact is rendered certain by this singular confession of the Lady Superior, and that is Roman Catholic interference in our elections. Jesuits are not in the habit of slighting their advantages, and the bishop who can control 10 or 20,000 or 500,000 men, as the case may be, for the purpose of destruction and riot, can certainly control the votes of these obedient instruments. Will not American free men wake to the apprehension of a truth like this? End of footnote. And what makes it turbulent? Ignorance, an ignorance which it is for the interest of its leaders not to enlighten. For enlighten a man, and he will think for himself, and have some self-respect. He will understand the laws, and know his interest in obeying them. Keep him in ignorance, and he is the slave of the man who will flatter his passions and appetites, or awe him by superstitious fears. Against the outbreakings of such men, society, as it is constituted on our free system, can protect itself only in one of two ways. It must either bring these men under the influence and control of a sound republican and religious education, or it must call in the aid of the priests who govern them, and who may permit and direct or restrain their turbulence, in accordance with what they may judge at any particular time to be the interest of the Church. Yes, be it well remarked, the same hands that can, whenever it suits their interest, restrain, can also, at the proper time, let slip the dogs of war. In this mode of restraint by a police of priests, by substituting the ecclesiastical for the civil power, the priest-led mobs of Portugal and Spain and South America are, instructive examples. And start not, American reader, this kind of police is already established in our country. We have had mobs again and again, which neither the civil nor military power have availed anything to quell, until the magic "Peace, be still" of the Catholic priest has hushed the winds and calmed the waves of popular tumult. Wow. Pause here. Side note, I'm just thinking of, if you read Chuck Wilcox's book, Transformation of the Republic, he documents how Abraham Lincoln, he had to quell the revolts in, I believe it was Boston, the Irish immigrants revolting. And it was shown, Wilcox documents it, how the priest went out and quelled them immediately. He just said the word. He was totally in control of this mob. So it's very easy to see how he probably was agitating them in the first place, anyway. Footnote. At the time this was written, riots in this country were almost entirely confined to the emigrants from foreign countries employed as laborers on our railroads, canals, etc. End of footnote. While I write, what I mean the negotiations between two Irish bands of immigrants, in hostile array against each other, shedding each other's blood upon our soil, settling with the bayonet miserable foreign feuds which they have brought over the waters with them. Why have not the civil and military power been able to restore order among them and obedience to our laws, without calling in the priests to negotiate and settle the terms on which they will cease from violating our laws? Footnote. As our readers have probably forgotten the particulars of the affair here alluded to, we subjoin from the Journal of Commerce a copy of the agreement subscribed by the leaders of the riot. The civil and military authorities of Maryland, there you go, Maryland, had tried repeatedly, but in vain, to quell the riot. From the Journal of Commerce, the rioters. It appears by the following notice that the rioters on the Baltimore and Washington Railroad have concluded a treaty of peace through the intervention of a priest. Wow, there you go. There was considerable talk during the late riots in this city of calling in the agency of the priests to put an end to the disturbance. No doubt it would have been effectual. Agreement. On the 24th of June, 1834, the subscribers, in the presence of the Reverend John McElroy, have respectively and mutually agreed to bury forever, on their own part, and on behalf of their respective sections of country, all remembrance of feuds and animosities, as well as injuries sustained. They also promise to each other and make a sincere tender of their intention to preserve peace, harmony, and good feeling between persons of every part of their native country without distinction. They further mutually agree to exclude from their houses and premises all disorderly persons of every kind, and particularly habitual drunkards. They are also resolved, and do intend to apply in all cases where it is necessary, to the civil authorities or to the laws of the country for redress. And finally, they are determined to use their utmost endeavors to enforce, by word and example, these their joint and unanimous resolutions, signed by 14 of the men employed on the 4th, 5th, and 8th sections of the 2D Division B and WRR on behalf of all employed, and also by the 13 of the 8th section of the 1st Division on behalf of all employed. End of footnote. Have priests become necessary in our political system? Have the emissaries of a foreign despotic power stolen this march upon us? Can they tell their foreign masters, quote, "We already rule the mob," unquote? Yes, and facts will bear them out in their boasting. And what now prevents the interference of Catholics as a sect directly in the political elections of the country? They are organized under their priests. Is there anything in their religious principles to restrain them? Do not Catholics of the present day use the bonds of religious union to effect political objects in other countries? Did not the Pope interfere in Poland in the late Revolution, and through the priests command submission to the tyranny of the Tsar? At the moment I am writing, are not monks and priests leaders in the field of battle in Spain and in Portugal? Is not the Pope encouraging the troops of Don Miguel and exciting priests and people to arms in a civil contest? Has Popery abandoned its ever busy meddling in the politics of the countries where it obtains a foothold? Footnote: political interference of Popery. The kind of interference in the political affairs of other countries by the sovereign of Rome may be learned from the following extracts from the Pope's proclamation against Don Pedro, in which he thus speaks of Portugal. He laments the defection of, quote, that kingdom cited until now as a model of devotion and of fidelity to the Catholic faith, to the Holy See, and to the Roman pontiffs, our predecessors, a kingdom which, as is meet, has already felt it an honor to obey its sovereigns, distinguished by the title of most faithful kings. We confess that we could not at first believe what report and public rumor related upon enterprises so audacious, but the unexpected return to Italy of him who represented us in the said kingdom as apostolic nuncio, and the most positive testimony of many persons, soon convinced us that what had been previously announced to us was but too true. Unquote. Quote, it is then as certain as it is greatly to be deplored that the above-mentioned government has unjustly driven away him who represented our person and the Holy See, commanding him to quit the kingdom without delay. But after so gross an insult offered to the Holy See and to us, the audacity of these perverse men has been carried still further against the Catholic Church, against ecclesiastical property, against the inviolable rights of the Holy See. Considering that all these measures have been exercised almost at the accession of a new power, and in consequence of a conspiracy prepared beforehand, our mind is filled with horror, and we cannot refrain from tears. All the public prisons have been opened, and, after having let those who were detained there go forth, they have thrown into them in their place some of those of whom it is written, touch not my anointed. Laymen have rashly arrogated to themselves a power over sacred things. They have proclaimed a general reform of the secular clergy and of religious orders of both sexes. Unquote. After enumerating various acts of rigor of the new government against those priests, monks, and other ecclesiastics who had taken an active part in the Civil War, the Pope continues, quote, for this reason, venerable brethren, we expressly proclaim that we absolutely reprobate all the decrees issued by the aforesaid government of Lisbon, to the great detriment of the Church, of its holy ministers, of the ecclesiastical law, and Holy See prerogatives. We, therefore, declare them to be null and of no effect, and express our most serious complaints against the audacious measures which we have referred to. We declare that, in exercising the duties of our office, and with God's help, we will oppose ourselves as a wall for the house of Israel, and show ourselves in the combat at the day of the Lord, as the interests of religion and the gravity of circumstances may require. Unquote. He hopes this low rumbling of the thunders of the Vatican will prevent his, quote, having recourse to those spiritual arms with which God has invested his apostolic ministry, unquote, namely, anathemas, curses, and of excommunication. And these are not the records of doings of the Dark Ages, but are fresh from the papal throne, the acts of 1833, end of footnote. Will it be said that, however officious in the old countries, yet here, by some strange metamorphosis, popery has changed its character, and is modified by our institutions, that here it is surely religious, seeking only the religious welfare of the people, that it does not meddle with the state? Footnote. If any suppose that popery meddles not with civil matters in this country, let them peruse the following extract of a letter from one of their missionaries. Quote, Mr. Baraga to the Central Direction of the Leopold Foundation, dated October 10th, 1832. On the 5th of August, after partaking the sacrament of confirmation, the bishop called all the chiefs and head men of the mission, and made known to them some civil laws which he had made for the Ottawas. The Indians received these laws with much pleasure, and promised solemnly to obey them. The missionary and 4 chiefs are the administrators of these laws. Signed, Frederick Baraga, missionary. Here is a specimen of the disposition of popery to meddle in civil matters in this country where it has the power. The bishop is the propounder, and the missionary one of the administrators of the civil laws. End of footnote. It is not true that popery meddles not with the politics of the country. The cloven foot has already shown itself. Popery is organized at the elections. For example, in Michigan, the Bishop Richard, a Jesuit, since deceased, was several times chosen delegate to Congress from the territory, the majority of the people being Catholics. As Protestants became more numerous, the contest between the bishop and his Protestant rival was more and more close, until at length, by the increase of Protestant immigration, the latter triumphed. The bishop, in order to detect any delinquency in his flock at the polls, had his ticket printed on colored paper. Whether any were so mutinous as not to vote according to orders, or what penance was inflicted for disobedience, I did not learn. The fact of such a truly Jesuitical mode of espionage I have from a gentleman resident at that time in Detroit. Is not a fact like this of some importance? Does it not show that popery, with all its speciousness, is the same here as elsewhere? It manifests, when it has the opportunity, its genuine disposition to use spiritual power for the promotion of its temporal ambition. It uses its ecclesiastical weapons to control an election. In Charleston, South Carolina, the Roman Catholic Bishop England is said to have boasted of the number of votes that he could control at any election. I have been informed, on authority which cannot be doubted, that in New York, a priest, in a late election for city officers, stopped his congregation after Mass on Sunday and urged the electors not to vote for a particular candidate, on the ground of his being an anti-Catholic. The result was the election of the Catholic candidate. It is unnecessary to multiply facts of this nature, nor will it be objected that these instances are unworthy of notice, because of their local or circumscribed character. Surely American Protestants, free men, have discernment enough to discover beneath them the cloven foot of this subtle foreign heresy, and will not wait for a more extensive, disastrous, and overwhelming political interference ere they assume the attitude of watchfulness and defense. They will see that popery is now what it has ever been, a system of the darkest political intrigue and despotism, cloaking itself to avoid attack under the sacred name of religion. They will be deeply impressed with the truth that popery is a political as well as a religious system, that in this respect it differs totally from all other sects, from all other forms of religion in this country. Popery embodies in itself the closest union of church and state. Observe it at the fountainhead. In the Roman states, the civil and ecclesiastical offices are blended together in the same individual. The Pope is the king. A cardinal is secretary of state. The consistory of cardinals is the cabinet council, the ministry, and they are viceroys in the provinces. The archbishops are ambassadors to foreign courts. The bishops are judges and magistrates, and the road to preferment to most, if not all, the great offices of state is through the priesthood. In Rome and the patrimony of St. Peter, the temporal and spiritual powers are so closely united in the same individual that no attack can be made on any temporal misrule without drawing down upon the assailants the vengeance of the spiritual power exercised by the same individual. Is the judge corrupt or oppressive? And do the people rise against him? The judge retires into the bishop, and in his sacred retreat cries, quote, "Touch not the Lord's anointed," unquote. Can we not discern the political character of popery? Shall the name religion, artfully connected with it, still blind our eyes? Let us suppose a body of men to combine together and claim as their right that all public and private property of whatever kind is held at their disposal, that they alone are to judge of their right to dispose of it, that they alone are authorized to think or speak on the subject, that they who speak or write in opposition to them are traitors and must be put to death, that all temporal power is secondary to theirs and amenable to their superior and infallible judgment, and the better to hide the presumption of these tyrannical claims. Suppose that these men should pretend to divine right and call their system religion, and so claim the protection of our laws, and pleading conscience demand to be tolerated. Would the name of religion be a cloak sufficiently thick to hide such absurdity, and shield it from the frown of public indignation? Take then from popery its name of religion, strip its officers of their pompous titles of sacredness, and its decrees of the nauseous cant of piety. And what have you remaining? Is it not a naked, odious despotism, depending for its strength on the observance of the strictest military discipline in its ranks, from the Pope, through his cardinals, archbishops, bishops, etc., down to the lowest priest of his dominions? And is not this despotism acting politically in this country? Footnote. Through the Leopold Foundation, reports there is this perpetual cant of piety. We have, quote-unquote, pious prelate, quote-unquote, pious purpose, quote-unquote, pious end, quote-unquote, pious curiosity, quote-unquote, pious dread, and even, quote-unquote, pious progress, and, quote-unquote, pious dress. Wow, that's a lot of piety coming from those folks, huh? Let us suppose, for the sake of illustration, that the Emperor of Russia, in a conceited dream of divine right to universal empire, should parcel out our country into convenient districts, and should proclaim his intention to exercise his rightful sway over these states, now not owning his control. Should we not justly laugh at his ridiculous pretensions? But suppose he should proceed to appoint his viceroys, grand imperial dukes, giving to one the title of quote-unquote, His Grace of Albany, and to another, the quote-unquote, Grand Duke of Washington, and to another, quote-unquote, His Imperial Highness of Savannah, and should send them out to take possession of their districts and subdue the people as fast as practicable to their proper obedience to his legitimate sway. And should these pompous viceroys with their train of sub-officers actually come over from Russia and erect their government houses and commence by compliant manners and fair promises to procure lands and rentals to hold in the power of the emperor, and under the guise of educating the rising generation should begin to sap the foundations of their attachment to this government by blinding their reasoning faculties, and by the Russian catechism instilling the doctrine of passive obedience and the divine right of the emperor. What should we say to all this? Ridiculous as the first conceited dream of imperial ambition appeared, if matters got to this pass, we should begin to think that there was something serious in the attempt, and very properly, too, be a little alarmed. Suppose then further that the emperor's cause, by Russian emigration, and the money supplied by the emperor, had become so strong that the viceroys were emboldened in a cautious way to try their influence upon some of the local elections, that the Russian party had become a body somewhat formidable, that its foreign leaders had their passive obedience troops so well under command as to make themselves necessary in the police of the country, that we feared to offend them, and that the secular press favored them, and the unprincipled courted them. To what point, then, in the process of gradually surrendering our liberties to the Russian Tsar, should we have come? And how near to their accomplishment would be those wild dreams of imperial ambition, which we had in the first instance ridiculed? Footnote. Is this a harsh judgment on the secular press? If a secular paper ventures to remonstrate against Catholics, is not the cry of intolerance or persecution at once raised, and the editor scared away from his duty of exposing the secret of political enemies of the Republic, under the false notion that he is engaged in a religious controversy? End of footnote. And is this scenario with the Russian Tsar that I have outlined a caricature? What is the difference between the real claims and efforts and condition of popery at this moment in these United States, and the supposed claims and efforts and condition of the Russian despotism I postulated? The one comes disguised under the name of religion. The other, more honest and more harmless, would come in its real political name. Give the latter the name of religion. Call the emperor Pope, and his viceroys bishops. Interlard the imperial decrees with pious cant, and you have the case of pretension and intrigue, and success, too, which has actually passed in these United States. Yes, the King of Rome, acting by the promptings of the Austrian cabinet, and in the plenitude of his usurpation, has already extended his scepter over our land. He has divided us up into provinces, and appointed his viceroys, who claim their jurisdiction from a higher power than exists in this country, even from his majesty himself, who appoints them, who removes them at will, to whom they owe allegiance, for the extension of whose temporal kingdom they are exerting themselves, and whose success, let it be indelibly impressed on your minds, is the certain destruction of the free institutions of our country. End of chapter 8. Samuel Morse. What a prophet. What a something. Man, he knew. The guy knew. 1835. Nobody listened. Goodbye. Could be conceived. Parents, we are aware, have not always the time or patience to examine these matters, but if they trust implicitly to us, we shall, with God's help, do it for them. We read that they may not read. Unquote. How kind. They will save parents all the trouble of judging for themselves, but, quote, we must be trusted implicitly, unquote. Would a Protestant journal thus dare to take liberties with its readers? End of footnote. My Lord Bishop Flaggett of Bardstown, Kentucky, in a letter to his patrons abroad, has this plain hint at an ulterior political design, and that no less that the entire subversion of our Republican government. Speaking of the difficulties and discouragements the Catholic missionaries have to contend with in converting the Indians, the last difficulty in the way, he says, is, quote, their continual traffic among the whites, which cannot be hindered as long as the Republican government shall subsist, unquote. What is this but saying that a Republican government is This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. This is going to be chapters 7 and 8 of the quote-unquote forgotten book of American inventor Samuel Morse. He wrote this in 1835. It's called Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. And it's a book, one of several books that the Collins brothers are afraid to research. That's Philip and Paul Michael, I believe. You hear them on all kinds of internet radio shows, and they're afraid to look into this stuff. I wonder why. Anyway, with that, Chapter 7, Samuel Morse's book. Let me next show the political character of this ostensibly religious effort from the sentiments of the Austrian emissaries expressed to their foreign patrons. The very nature of a conspiracy of this kind precludes the possibility of much direct evidence of political design. For Jesuit cunning and Austrian duplicity would be sure to tread with unusual caution on American ground. Yet, if I can quote from their correspondence some expressions of antipathy to our free principles and to the government, some hinting at the subversion of the government, prevailing partialities for arbitrary government, and siding with tyranny against the oppressed, and some acknowledgments of political effects to be expected from the operations of the society, I shall have exhibited evidence enough to put every citizen who values his birthright upon the strict watch of these men and their adherents, and to show the importance of some measures of repelling this insidious invasion of the country. The Bishop of Baltimore, writing to the Austrian Society, laments the wretched state of the Catholic religion in Virginia, and as a proof of the difficulty it has to contend with, a proof doubtless shocking to the pious docility of his Austrian readers, he says, quote, I sent to Richmond a zealous missionary, a native of America. He traveled through the whole of Virginia. The Protestants flocked on all sides to hear him. They offered him their churches, courthouses, and other public buildings to preach in, which, however, is not at all surprising, for the people are divided into numerous sects, and know not what faith to embrace, favorable in its nature to the restrictions we deem necessary to the extension of the Catholic religion. When the time shall come that the present government shall be subverted, which we are looking forward to or hope for, we can then hinder this traffic? Mr. Baraga, the German missionary in Michigan, seems impressed with the same conviction of the unhappy influence of a free government upon his attempts to make converts to the Church of Rome. In giving an account of the refusal of some persons to have their children baptized, he lays the fault on this, quote, too free government, unquote. In a more despotic government, in Italy or Austria, he would have been able to put in force compulsory baptism on these children. Footnote, compulsory baptism. Perhaps Father Baraga was thinking of the facilities afforded in Spain in the time of Ximenes for administering baptism when, quote, 50,000 Moors under terror of death and torture received the grace of baptism, and more than an equal number of the refractory were condemned, of whom 2,536 were burnt alive. In consequence of being spoiled by bad instruction, they will judge everything themselves. They, therefore, hear eagerly every newcomer, unquote. The bishop, if he had the power, would of course change this bad instruction for better, and, as in Catholic countries, would relieve them from the trouble of judging for themselves. Thus, the liberty of private judgment and freedom of opinion guaranteed by our institutions are avowedly an obstacle to the success of the Catholics. Is it not natural that Catholics should desire to remove this obstacle out of their way? Footnote. A Catholic journal of this city, the Register and Diary, was put into my hands, I, Samuel Morse, as I have completed this last paragraph. It contains the same sentiment, so illustrative of the natural abhorrence of Catholics to the exercise of private judgment, that I cannot forbear quoting it. Quote, we seriously advise Catholic parents to be very cautious in the choice of school books for their children. There is more danger to be apprehended in this quarter than